forgot my next and happy task of introducing Pete Wehner, who is someone I have respected and admired from a distance for quite some time, and am enjoying more recently the privilege of getting to know. What I'm discovering in that process is that the clear thought, the humility, the open mind and heart that come through in Pete's writing comes through even more in person. Pete is a very thoughtful conservative who has been willing to enter into dialogue with folks across various divides, and he brings tremendous depth to that challenge and opportunity. Pete has served in progressively more responsible positions in the last 3 Republican administrations, going back to the Reagan administration. In the George W. Bush administration, he was in the White House from 2001 to 2007, initially as the Deputy Director for Speechwriting, but from 2002 to 2007 as the head of the White House Office on Strategic Innovations. He's a prolific author, regular contributor to the New York Times. Tells me he has a forthcoming book coming out on how to mend our fraying politics after Trump. I hope I got that at least almost right. So it's with great pleasure and anticipation I invite Pete up. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Bob, for that introduction and really those lovely and thoughtful remarks, and to Mayor Mike for hosting this, and for all the organizations, ADL, NASPN Institute, Coke, and the rest for sponsoring this, and to all of you for coming out here and for taking the time and lending your hearts and your hands to this important work, which is to try and heal this country, which needs it. I'm going to just speak for a few minutes. The speech won't last as long as it seems, and then I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Bob. I was asked actually to speak on the topic of why politics matters. It is the subject of my forthcoming book, but I probably would speak on it even if I wasn't writing on it, because it matters to me, and I want to sketch out some of the reasons why. But I want to begin by pointing out that politics is a profession of trial and error, of adjustment and readjustment, and we can't expect anything like perfection. But what we can reasonably expect from lawmakers is competence, good judgment, and integrity, and some degree of commitment to the public interest and the common good. We should also expect to find, at least now and then, a spirit of sympathy, conciliation, and magnanimity. The great 18th century statesman and philosopher Edmund Burke, when he was lauding the British system of government compared to the revolutions in France, said, "We compensate, we reconcile, we balance. We are enabled to unite into a consistent whole the various anomalies and contending principles that are found in the minds and affairs of men." Now, the ability to compensate, reconcile, and balance various anomalies and contending principles isn't a simple task, and it's not one that just anyone off the street can do. But those who we elect to public office need to be able to do that. Which brings me to the role of citizenship and civic responsibility, of how we think and what we need to do. And in this instance, I think what we need to do means getting off the sidelines, to refuse to be spectators. The qualities that the most active and engaged Americans demand in politicians is what they will get. If enough citizens lend their hands and their hearts, their voices, and their votes to men and women who embody, even if imperfectly, intellectual rigor and wise judgment, mastery of government and moral integrity, our politics will be transformed. But we have to care enough to act. We have to care enough to act. We can't be a nation of onlookers. And to your credit, you are not onlookers. You are engaged in this effort. My own view is we've stumbled into a kind of bread and circuses era in American politics, with the entertainment supplied to us on a daily basis by the president above all, but also by others in public office, by social media, and by commentators having frivolous screaming matches on cable news programs. The whole spectacle is dumbing us down, but we're not fated to stay where we are. We can, in the words of the novelist Flannery O'Connor, push as hard as the age that pushes against you. Politics, rightly understood, isn't about fun and games, about entertainment and stagecraft, nor is it merely about expressing one's values and excoriating the other person's. It's about the hard and intricate work of solving pressing human problems, about getting more big things right than wrong, and in the process, making the world a little bit better, a little less inhumane, and a little more just. You and I, our friends and neighbors, our colleagues and acquaintances, are the true authors of the American story. We're not like corks caught in ocean currents, powerless to shape our future. We can shape the outcome of events. The problems we face as a nation, while significant, are hardly beyond our control or our capacity to repair. It's just cynical nonsense to assume that what you say and do doesn't matter. The history of America would have been profoundly different if in 1860 it had elected John Breckinridge, Stephen A. Douglas, or John Bell as president instead of Abraham Lincoln. All right, now we're not facing a civil war, a world war, or a Great Depression. In fact, America faces right now no external crisis at all. Instead, it faces a crisis of confidence and of comprehension. Confidence in the ability of politics to navigate adequately, never perfectly, but adequately, the many conflicts and dilemmas that confront our country, and comprehension of the complexity and compromise that every politician needs to cope with. It's true that complaining about politics and politicians is the American way, and it's justified up to a point, but only up to a point. When it gives way to nihilism, cynicism, and the abdication of governing hard choices, then it verges into a kind of civic corruption. And as a remedy for nihilism and cynicism, it may be helpful to remember that the politician who led us through the Civil War, the two World Wars, and the Depression were made of the same flawed human stuff as are the politicians of today. Americans are fortunate that several of them were great, and greatness is certainly in short supply today, but it usually is, and even the great ones made mistakes along the way. In addition, the political system of their eras, like ours, struggled with corruption, inefficiency, and disputatiousness. Politics is never going to be pretty. It just needs to work, and for that, it needs a public that will allow it to work and a public that insists that it work. In June 1966, Senator Robert Kennedy undertook a 5-day trip to South Africa. It was during the worst period of apartheid, and during that trip, he delivered one of his most memorable speeches, and it's one of my favorite speeches. I used to go to the Suzzallo Library at University of Washington, where I went to school, and I would listen to speeches by John and Bobby Kennedy, even though I had been a lifelong Republican and a conservative, but I thought that their words were powerful and spoke to deep truths. And in speaking to young people, in particular in South Africa, Bobby Kennedy warned about, quote, the danger of futility, the belief there is nothing one man or one woman can do against the enormous arrays of the world's ills, against misery and ignorance, injustice and violence, close quote. Kennedy urged people to have moral courage to enter the conflict and to fight for their ideals. And using words that would later be engraved by his gravesite at Arlington National Cemetery, he said this: each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, these ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. No figure of Kennedy's stature had ever visited South Africa to make the case against institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination, and that trip had an electric effect, especially on black South Africans. It gave them hope that they weren't alone, that the outside world knew and cared about their struggle for equality. And pressure from within and outside of South Africa eventually resulted in the end of apartheid, and in 1994, Nelson Mandela who was imprisoned in Robben Island during the time that Kennedy was visiting, was elected the first black president of South Africa. Now, America today is not like South Africa in the 1960s, but there's a timelessness to Kennedy's words, including when he said, "Decisions of government shape all of our lives, and so much that is worthwhile can be swept away when we get things wrong." I believe, because the state of our politics is so poor right now, and the role politics plays in human flourishing and human suffering is so vital, we need to recover a proper sense of what it is and what it's not. And among other things, we need to resist those in public life who are seeking to use words as weapons to annihilate the concept of truth. Deep differences will always exist in our country. The goal of politics is to find ways to live peaceably and even respectfully given those differences. Democratic virtues of moderation, compromise, and civility are necessary and vital if our country is to function well. And we have to bear in mind, too, that politics is fundamentally about problem solving. If politics isn't making things better in people's lives in ways that are concrete and practical, then it's failing in one of its primary responsibilities. A few years ago, my friend Charles Krauthammer, who passed away earlier this year, published a collection of his writings over the years. It's titled Things That Matter. It was originally going to be a collection of everything but politics. The working title, in fact, was There's More to Life Than Politics. In the end, though, he couldn't do it for this reason. Charles understood that much lives or dies by politics, and if you get it wrong, everything stands to be swept away. Politics is the moat, the wall behind which lie the barbarians, he wrote. Fail to keep them at bay, and everything burns. There are many things that give purpose and meaning to our lives that lie beyond politics. Human relationships, family and friendships, music, movies, art, sports, philosophy, poetry and books, nature and faith. Our lives are enriched through book clubs and in Bible studies, in volunteering at homeless shelters and at school events, watching our children play sports, perform in plays, connecting with old friends, going to NASCAR races and rodeos, visiting art museums and Disney World, hiking in the mountains, and taking vacations at the beach. At its best, politics gives us the space to live our lives and pursue our passions, some of them grand, some of them ordinary, some of them silly. And at its very best, politics ennobles us by attaching us to great causes for justice and human dignity. But that can't happen unless and until we recover a sense of the importance of politics, a respect for the craft of governing, and the value of competence and excellence. Sometimes people idealize politics, and when they do, it's a mistake, but so is constantly denigrating it. Today, we're leaning far too much in the direction of the denigration. We need to raise our sights to expect more from politicians and ourselves. Ours is a remarkable republic if we can keep it, so let's keep it. Thanks very much, and I think now you and I will have a conversation.
Very good. Good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Do you care?
Okay.
Well, I've been wanting to have a chance to talk to you. I didn't know we'd have this conversation up here in front of a bunch of friends, but that's great. Citizens, we get the government we deserve,
Right.
What I'm hearing you say. And what's in short supply on the citizenship front are these essential virtues.
Right.
So moderation, compromise, civility, the big three maybe, but in some of the other things I've read, you talk about humility,
Right.
Modesty. Why do you think those are in such short supply?
Well, it's a complicated answer. I think some of it is actually what you talked on. We are living in a particularly polarized time. And the reasons for the polarization are severalfold. Some of it's obvious. Some of it is that we have a president who's unlike any other president we've had, not in the sense of being polarized. This country's been getting polarized for decades. So Bill Clinton was more polarizing than George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush more than Clinton, Obama more than Bush, and Trump more than Obama. So the country itself has been getting that way. What's different now is that we have, as a president, someone who seems to relish the idea of divisions and inflaming. So that just is a very difficult task that we have right now. But Donald Trump didn't invent these conditions. He's accelerated them, in my estimation, in every way. The other reasons, just to quickly touch on them, is there's been a purification of the political parties that's gone on for decades. As Senator Danforth will remember this, but there used to be liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. So in the 1980s, right, when Ronald Reagan, who was the great conservative, was president, you've had people like Charles Percy and Bob Packwood and Mark Hatfield, Republicans who were more liberal, and on the left you had, or in the Democratic Party, you had Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Joe Lieberman. That's essentially gone now. And so what's happened is the two parties are more purified and more extreme. You've had what social scientists call big sort. So what we've begun to do is sort ourselves apart geographically, through faith, through lifestyle. Then you've got social media, which you touched on. So this is a new phenomenon, relatively new phenomenon. I mean, in the past, in the 60s and 70s, and really even the 80s, you had three networks. Everybody was getting kind of the same information. Now you have these silos. And if you want, you can go and have reinforced every predisposition and every view that you have. And if you're conservative, you watch Fox, from morning to night. If you're liberal, you watch MSNBC. And then I think there's another phenomenon which is happening, which is that we have an epidemic of loneliness that's going on, and that has real human consequences. We just had the CDC came out with a study today that said that the lifespan of Americans has dropped for a second year in a row, which is extraordinary. It's the first time that's happened since World War I. So it's about 100 years. And that's driven by really two things primarily. One is overdose deaths due to drugs. We've now got, this is a staggering figure, more than 70,000 deaths a year due to overdose, and suicide. You're seeing a very sharp increase in suicide, particularly among young people, particularly young males. So there's a phenomenon going on of loneliness where I think a lot of people, because there's a fracturing of community, they invest an awful lot in politics. Politics becomes a kind of community for them. And it creates these kind of tribal loyalties. I think part of it is on those troika of virtues, compromise, moderation, civility. We stopped talking about them. I think we stopped explaining to each other why those things matter, why they are actually virtues. And I think that even the definition of them has gotten all tangled up. So a lot of times when people hear words like moderation or compromise, they think they're synonymous for lack of principle, no deep compassion, no deep passion. So I think we stopped doing the kind of teaching that we have to do, and we've stopped modeling it, and we've stopped having public leaders make the case for them.
Just picking up on that last thought, when we had a chance to talk earlier in the week, one of the things that you said that really landed with me is the importance of leaders talking to their own tribes about these issues. We've got a whole room full of leaders here, so I'd invite you to expand that thought.
Yeah, it's because the tribalism is so acute these days. I think sometimes we think that if we just talk about it and lecture each other about it, that's going to make things better. And in my experience, it doesn't in this respect. If you have a liberal, let's say a liberal President Barack Obama lecturing conservatives on civility or on lack of tribalism or on confirmation bias, that not only, or vice versa, conservative president lecturing the Democratic Party, that not only doesn't work, it exacerbates the problem, because the reaction is, who the heck are you to lecture me? And people dig in their heels, and so it makes the situation worse. I think what we do need is we need people within our own tribes, people with standing in our own communities or our own political parties, to actually call out people within those communities and to say, look, you've stepped over a line. And we can't have that. And I think if that were to happen, that would be huge, but it just hasn't gone on very much. And I think one of the challenges we have is increasingly there's a lack of authority figures in our lives. And so there aren't the kind of people that there may have been decades ago and centuries ago who have the ability to do that. I just want to pick up too on something you said, which I feel a lot of sympathy for and agreement with, which is this idea of listening to people on the other side. That is not an easy thing to do. It's much easier to say than it is to do. Just like when we talk about bias, confirmation bias, or lack of civility, it's so easy to see in other people, and it's so hard to see for people on our side, and it's particularly hard for us to see in ourselves. A couple of points on that. One is, I think we've actually forgotten why the deeper purposes of genuine dialogue and debate. And I put myself very much in this category. As we get into these debates, and our mindset is, I've got to beat this person. I've got to kind of shatter them by my arguments and show them that they're wrong, and pull them over. And there's a different way of understanding that, which is these relationships are to serve the purpose of widening our kind of intellectual and moral apertures and seeing things better. It's sort of the wisdom of the collective. There's a story of C.S. Lewis in his book Surprised by Joy where he talks about first and second friends. And he said the first friend, for him it was a person named Arthur Greaves. It was somebody he knew from his childhood. And he said the first friend is your alter ego. It's the person who can complete your sentences when you start them, who sees the world the same way that you do. Lewis has a beautiful description when he distinguishes between lovers and friends. He said lovers look face to face, friends look shoulder to shoulder, and so they look at the world the same way. And there's something wonderful about first friends. We all have them, we all need them. But then he went on to talk about his second friend, and his second friend was someone named Owen Barfield, who was part of the Inklings, which is a literary group that Lewis held. And when he's describing Owen Barfield, he said, Owen and I, he said, that is the anti-self. That's the person who reads all the same books you do and draws all the wrong conclusions from them. And he talks about how Lewis and Barfield would go back and forth, hammer and tong, he says, late into the night, arguing, debating. What was interesting is that both of them took great delight and treasured their friendship precisely because they felt like they were better having engaged one another, because they felt like each of them could learn something from the other that they wouldn't know without the other. And that's why when you were saying that, and the Trump supporters and Trump critics have to learn how to talk. One other anecdote. I have a friend who's a national radio talk show host. I've been very public in my criticisms of Donald Trump. He's very much a fan, and we've tried to keep the connection and the friendship. But time to time, there's stress, and there was one point in which he had written me an email. It was actually because I had something I'd written critical of Trump. Anyway, to make a long story short, in one of his emails, he made 3 or 4 charges against me. And so I was ready. I was like, I'm going to write, a 12-page email. It's going to be a point by. I was born to do this, a kind of empirical, methodical demolition of his argument. And probably 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I would have done that. But what I thought about it. Well, first, I don't think I had the time to write it. Secondly, it's not going to be productive because it's not going to convince him. And third, it's going to harm the relationship, and I'm going to have to then spend time trying to repair it. So I threw that email aside, and I wrote him back, and I won't tell you his name, but I wrote him and I said, look, I'll answer charges if you want, but let me try and explain to you how, as best I can, how you view things, and let me explain how I view things. And so I laid out from his perspective as a Trump supporter,
He believed that he was being loyal, that Trump was being demolished by the rest of the press, and listeners could go anywhere else, and that Trump's success was tied to America's success. He believed that. And he believed that Trump was the quarterback, he was the offensive lineman, and it was part of loyalty to defend him. I said, for me, it's a matter of intellectual integrity. This is where I'm coming from. If Obama or Clinton did something that I criticize them for, and if Trump does it and I don't, then that just doesn't have integrity. Then it's all a game to me. You've got to use the same standard. And I didn't put a weight of value on which was better or worse. I just said, this is what I think you're doing, this is what I'm doing. So what was interesting is when he wrote me back, he said, I've read your email 3 times. He said it was like a light going on. He said, you're right. I don't care about the intellectual integrity. I'm an advocate. That's what I do. But what happened is we stayed in relationship. And as time has unfolded, he's been able to see my perspective and I've been able to see his. But it's not easy.
Yeah, I think that there are way too many relationships that have been broken by this, and we've got to learn how to put them back together. I wanted to just drill down a little bit deeper on this central importance of virtue. I have a friend who I'm in conversation with about this, and he offered the working definition of a virtue is a habitual orientation toward a value, toward living a value.
Yeah.
And I think the emphasis on habitual is really worth reflecting on, and leads to the question of where do we develop those habits? And one place that's taken me is saying, what are the institutions in our society that we have traditionally relied on for call it the moral formation of citizens?
Yeah.
So in my case, the family, faith community, schools to some extent, and just involvement in community organizations. Now, one thing that worries me is that I think all of those institutions have become progressively weaker in their ability, either in their scope and scale to engage, or the ability. First off, would you be inclined to see it that way? And if so, what do you think the implications are? This is not a quick fix.
No, I mean, with the kind of things that you're dealing with here in these couple of days and that we talk about, there's no magic wand in any of this, and there's no quick fix out. And if you think there is, you're just setting yourself up for disappointment. Look, I think that's very good. I mean, your friend sounds to me like he's an Aristotelian. I mean, right? That's very much, that's what Aristotle taught, which is the whole idea about the importance of habit and conforming your heart and mind, and how that's done really through habit. And you name the institutions. This was something that, at least once upon a time, conservatives cared a lot about, which is what social scientists call mediating institutions. And Tocqueville wrote about in Democracy in America, these voluntary associations. I'd say traditionally the family is kind of the seedbed of virtue. There's really no substitute for it, and that just requires to have parents in the lives of children who give them unconditional love and order and discipline. And if the family fractures, and if that isn't going on, then you're just facing an uphill challenge. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't teach virtue without it. It just means that it's harder. Schools used to be, even colleges and universities, in loco parentis. There was an idea that colleges and universities and schools and education generally were concerned with the formation of human character. We've lost that over decades, and it's now very tricky territory for schools, so they don't want to do it. And you talked about faith institutions. I'm a person of the Christian faith, so that's been, it was a long journey for me, but it's been something that's been very important. That has influence for some people, not others. But even there, a lot of churches have weakened. And I must say, as a person of traditionally the evangelical faith, I think that evangelical Christians, in the way that they've conducted themselves in politics, particularly the last 2 years or so, have really discredited their faith. And politics has a role in that. I mean, that really is, Aristotle's idea of statecraft as soulcraft, but that's limited, and I'd be very wary to put too much weight in what politicians can do. On the other hand, they do model certain kinds of behavior, and once in a while you get some people who are real kind of shining lights of integrity, and sometimes not. And that matters. But the founders knew that it was actually Lincoln who said that if the public, if there was virtue in the public, that there was no president in a 4-year period who could ruin the country. But all of the founders knew that without virtue, without integrity, without moral excellence, without human excellence in the citizenry, if you lose that, there's no structure, whether it's checks and balances. I mean, I think the founders were brilliant in the way they set up the American system and the government. But in the end, it's not parchment paper, to use their phrase. It's not Congress or the presidency. That you can't make up for it. But I'll also say, and I'm guessing a lot of you know this in your own lives, whether you've been the recipient of somebody's love or the love that you've given to others, there's just, we were talking about this earlier, there's just nothing like it. And if you can take people in very hard circumstances, but if they feel that some adult, some person in their life loves them, cares for them, listens to them, has standing in their life, that can really do a lot to heal a life and to heal the life of a country.
So I sat looking this way because I'm tempted to ignore the clock that's over here, but it just wound down. So I wish we could continue this, and I want to thank you for opening up these crucially important issues in such a thoughtful way.
I enjoyed chatting with you. Thanks. And thanks again for you all for being here.